All right, let's see here. So, good morning. My name is John Cohoon. I really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your Saturday to come and learn about trees and kind of how to go about things. So this presentation really is all about trees. It's geared towards urban tree care and urban tree management, and how we go about evaluating trees, what we do in terms of management, what are our options, and then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about reporting trees. Generally, they're going to be street trees that we would be reporting, but what does that process look like, and why do we go about that?
Where the rocks are right there, we have a line of concrete.
I'm sorry.
I think it was just someone who joined, so I muted them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So a little bit about me. When we started planning this program, I was the horticulture technical assistant with the Ruth Mott Foundation. Since then, I have moved on, and now I am a professional arborist. I run a tree crew for a regional tree company, and 5 days a week, I am up in a 75-foot bucket, or I'm on a climb line doing the things that we're going to talk about today. So I've got a lot of experience with this. I'm pretty comfortable with a lot of the things that are going on. I am a certified arborist, and then I'm also a graduate student with the forestry department at Michigan State. So if you guys have questions, even if they feel a little bit off topic, even if it's from a couple of slides ago or something like that, feel free to speak up and ask questions. I don't mind being interrupted. But as far as I'm concerned, if this is just going to be a 45-minute monologue, it's kind of boring. So spice it up for me. If you guys have questions or thoughts or whatever, I'm more than happy to field those. I may not be able to answer a specific question about this specific tree in your yard, but I'll do the best that I can. So we're going to work on some basic tree identification. We're going to talk about the basics of tree care, signs of a hazard tree, and then we're going to go into how the city would like trees to be reported and kind of what that process would look like for getting a tree managed appropriately. So, really quickly, the most important thing when it comes to tree care is you need to know what it is that you're working with. So we're going to do a little bit of basic tree identification. We're not going to go super in depth into this. There's a lot of information here. This is more designed to be a resource than it is designed to, get everybody equipped to identify all the trees on their block or something like that. So, first things first, trees generally are divided into two categories. You have flowering trees, and then you have trees that produce cones. Generally speaking, this also is the same way that trees are classified, either into hardwoods or not hardwoods. So generally, deciduous trees or trees that have broad leaves that would drop them in what we think of as a normal not pine tree would be considered flowering trees. So that would be oaks, maples, beeches, birches, hickory trees, all those sorts of things, crabapple trees, and then conifers, cedars, pine, spruce, firs, and then there are some other things that also produce needles, things like tamaracks and cypress and things like that. But for the most part, that's kind of how things are split up when you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, and that kind of helps when you're moving through some of the other things. So we're going to start out with oaks. They're very common. There's a lot of different species in the state. Generally speaking, oaks are split into two groups, and this is true all across the country, but it's easiest to see here in the Midwest. You've got white oaks and you've got red oaks. And this is really important if you can sort of tell the difference between the two in terms of disease susceptibility and sort of broader kind of management strategies. So today specifically, we're going to be looking at some leaves from white oaks, from swamp white oaks, from bur oaks, red oaks, and black oaks. And if you'll notice, these are the white oaks, and the easiest way to sort of tell these apart is that when you look at the lobes on the leaf, or like the tip of the leaf, this area here is going to be rounded. So, these are all going to have rounded edges or rounded lobes when you look at them. And then when we go on to red oaks, they're going to have really pointed lobes or really pointed sort of fingers that come out on the leaves. That is the easiest way to sort of tell the two groups apart. And this really matters, like I said, when we kind of get into identification as far as if we're going to manage it, is it a red oak or is it a white oak? And that's going to matter in terms of what are our options at different times of the year. When it comes to winter identification, the easiest way to do this one, when you look at red oaks, you'll notice that the plates on the bark are kind of long, but they connect together. I've heard it described as like ski trails. So if you look at, if you've ever been out skiing, kind of the pattern that's left in the snow, all of these plates are going to hook together. On white oaks, they don't do that. There's a lot of horizontal breaks in the bark, in the scales on the bark. So it's more like bricks in a wall than it is like ski trails. And so once you kind of get an eye for it, you don't even need to look up. You can just sort of look through the woods and you can say, those are reds and these are whites. And once you get familiar with it, it goes pretty quick. But there are ways to do it both summertime and in the winter. So that matters most because in the state, we have a disease. It's called oak wilt. It's always been here, but for whatever reason, it really seems to be on the rise lately. And that is causing a lot of problems in terms of our oak populations. There's a lot of cities, a lot of municipalities that have a lot of oak trees, and it's sort of an iconic tree in our landscape. But oak wilt is decimating our oak trees. Red oaks will last anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks, and then they can go from perfectly healthy to completely dead. There's no cure for it. There's no treatment for it. Really, oak wilt and a lot of tree diseases are basically all about prevention. Once a tree gets infected with a fungus, it is very difficult to sort of turn the tide and to get it back going again. There are some diseases where you can sort of prolong the life of the tree, but oak wilt's not one of them. White oaks tend to be able to last a couple of years instead of just a couple of weeks. And the way that oak wilt spreads is it is a fungus, but it's transferred by a sap beetle. And that beetle moves from one tree to the next, and it sort of smells that sap that would be produced in a wound, and it goes to feed on that sap, and then the fungus is transferred by spore from one tree to the next. And so if you're going to be working on oak trees, you can't really be doing that while you have, insect movement out in the landscape, because that is going to be the vector that would infect your next round of trees. And so really the best thing that you can do is wait and kind of do all of your oak work after the warm months have passed, and once we're kind of getting into the cooler months. So really our oak work is starting right about this time of year, and this is when we're going to try to do our majority of that stuff.
John,
Yes.
are you allowed to stop, like somebody? I would assume anybody who's a reputable tree trimmer would not be trimming oaks when they're not supposed to. But if someone's trimming somebody's oak on private property, like, can we stop them in any way, or?
So you can't really stop them, but what you can do is you can ask them sort of what steps they're going to take to mitigate that. So let's say that we get one of those really severe thunderstorms that kind of rolls through in July or August, and we get wind damage to an oak tree. There's nothing you can do about it. Now we've got this big hanging limb and it's hanging over my garage. Like, unfortunately, oak wilt's not a good enough reason for me to not save my garage. I've got to do something about this. And in a situation like that, yes, we'd go out and absolutely we'd remove the limb. We would clear the hazard away. But what you can do is at that point, you can use like pruning seal and you can cover up that wound so that it's no longer a problem. But when you're going to do that, from the perspective of the guy that's actually up doing the work, it's a lot more tedious and it's a lot more of a process, because every time I make a cut with my saw, I immediately have to paint that wound. I can't make all of my cuts and then paint 15 minutes later. The beetles have been documented when they're doing research, showing up in as little as a minute or two. And so you've got to be on the spot when you're starting to make those cuts. Wounds that are older than about 48 hours have been shown to not be susceptible to a new infection. So if you have a piece that breaks out of your oak tree and you call somebody and they say, well, we can't get to it for a week, then it's not worth them coming out at all. Because after 48 hours, the tree has been able to seal itself up well enough that that's no longer a problem. If you have a hazard, if you've got, a piece that's hanging out of the tree, absolutely, they should still come out and take care of that. But in terms of defending your tree against oak wilt, that's not really going to be effective, just because the window for infection is pretty short. So I wouldn't suggest trying to, intervene or something like that. I do know that the DNR has published regulations saying that they don't allow pruning of oak trees. I believe it's from April 15th to July 15th, but the research is showing that that window is definitely like the high risk time, but there's still a noticeable risk outside of that window. And so generally it's more about making sure you're doing it in temperatures that are cold enough that the insects just aren't active. And we all know the weather here in Michigan. We can have warm days and those bugs will start moving around well before the middle of April and well after the middle of July. So I know as a company, we have made the determination that we are not going to be responsible for a new disease infection. And so we won't do oak work if we think that the temperatures are going to be warm enough that we could have a potential infection, because we don't want to be responsible for that. There's a lot of companies that have managed that have decided to take on that same management strategy. But then there are also companies like, companies that are contracting for utilities and things like that, where they just don't have that luxury. And when they get to an oak tree that's, growing into the power lines, that needs to be pruned. And, they're supposed to be using pruning seal or some sort of a wound paint, but whether that happens or not is really hard to say. And I can't really speak for every company. I know that it's also been shown that you don't have to have like a specialty wound paint. I know I've done a couple of oak jobs that have been in the summertime, for friends and things like that. And now their oak tree matches their living room. Regular latex paint works just fine. It does the same thing. They had a green living room and I was like, you won't see it in a couple of weeks. And so we use just green paint and a paintbrush. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. You don't need to overthink it. You're just keeping those fungal spores off of that freshly cut wood.
John, can I ask a question about my oaks? So I've got a huge red oak in my backyard that a couple years ago I got a crazy crop of acorns. Like I've never seen it. I've been in this house for 20 some years. It was so much. And then this year I have had 0 acorns at all. Is that okay? Is that a sign of anything? Should I be worried about the tree?
So that isn't surprising to me at all. Acorns will do a lot of different things. They kind of do a lot of weird things, but generally speaking, oaks are going to have what are called mast years. So the idea behind it is that if every year you produce a consistent amount of acorns, then every year you'd be able to feed a consistent amount of squirrels. So you'd never really be able to, have a good reproductive year, because the squirrels are always going to sort of eat up all your acorns. But if every year you produce 10 acorns and then, 1 out of 10, you produce 100 acorns, there's just not enough squirrels to eat all of those seeds. And some of them will be able to be successful and not get messed with. And so they have these like really big boom and bust cycles. And from the sounds of it, you had a boom year, and for whatever reason, you know, all of the different things came together just right. The weather was perfect. You got rain when you needed it. You know, there wasn't a big windstorm that caused things to happen. And that was just a super duper good year when it was already going to be what's called a mast year. Typically, if you don't get any acorns at all, that means that there was some sort of like a weird freeze or something happened, and maybe like the seed crop that year just didn't take off. Similar to like our apple orchards, you know, if we get a really late freeze, we won't get any apples that year because it messed with the flowers. Typically, if a tree is stressed or if a tree is getting to the end of its life, it will start producing more seeds. So if a tree is not producing seed, that's usually not a sign of something catastrophic coming, because if the tree thinks it's going to die, it's going to do everything that it can to produce more trees rather than just sort of going quietly. I do know at the Mott estate at Applewood, they have an apple tree that's going to be 103, I think, next year at least. And that is one of the most productive trees in the orchard because it's super old and it takes every bit of energy that it's got and it pushes it into making more trees because it knows that it's running out of time. So typically speaking, if you have a tree that's not producing seed, that's usually not a huge cause for concern. Any other questions while we're here? All right. So moving on, maples. There are a ton of maples in the state. Maples are a super common street tree. There are a lot of them that are native in Michigan. We have some that aren't necessarily native that, you know, people kind of go back and forth between whether or not they want to call them invasive or not. That's kind of a discussion for another time, but today I'd like to focus on 5 species: the Norway, the red, the sugar, the silver, and the black. So Norway maples, you're going to see a lot. They are really popular street trees. The nursery industry has come up with a lot of different cultivars for Norway maples. Sometimes you see them. They're called Crimson King. They're like that really nice kind of burgundy maple tree. It stays that color all year round. Those are just Norway maples that have been bred to be purple. So you also have the sugar maple and the black maple. The black maple is not very common. I know those leaves sort of look similar, but if you see something that kind of looks like that, odds are you've got a sugar maple. I only know of a few black maples where I'm at, and we have a lot of sugar maples all over the place. Red maples, they are kind of easy to identify. There's year round, there's always something kind of red on the tree. In the wintertime, like right now, there's no leaves, but the buds are still on there for next year. Those are going to have that reddish color. In the spring, it's going to set seeds. The seeds are going to be red. In the summertime, the stem on the leaf is going to be red. So this is going to be red. And then in the fall, the whole leaf turns red. So those ones are really easy to identify. And also the leaf shape, it's only got like 3 lobes, whereas most of the other maples will have 5. So red maple is pretty easy. Silver maple, you know, similar to a lot of the other ones, but if you notice, like those fingers or those lobes on the leaves are really well defined and they've got really deep sort of cut-ins. So once you kind of get out there and you start looking, they're pretty easy to spot as well. So again, the rest of this information is really just so that when this presentation gets posted places, people can kind of use it to go back and reference. But a couple of things that I do think are worth pointing out. So when you have, some trees have what are called compound leaves. So this whole thing is a single leaf from a black walnut tree. These, what most people would consider to be leaves, are actually called leaflets. And, you know, walnut commonly grows in urban areas as well as ash, although ash doesn't get very big anymore because we have the emerald ash borer. But it still is a presence in the landscape. And the easiest way to sort of tell these two apart is that the green ash is going to have an odd number of leaflets, so it's going to have one kind of sticking off the end, whereas the walnut is going to have an even number, and it doesn't have the single leaflet coming off the end. But the walnut is really valuable for sort of specialty timber uses and things like that. Ash trees, a lot of people, really use them for firewood and things like that. They're, if you can keep them alive and healthy, they're beautiful trees. So definitely things that you'll probably notice out in the landscape, and things that are a valuable part of the system. Catalpa is also another really popular tree. They've got really large, like leathery leaves. Kind of, if you go to pick up your leaves in the fall, and you've got these monster kind of heart-shaped leaves that they get wet and they stay wet and they're almost impossible to rake. Probably Catalpa. We have a lot of apples and crab apples in the state. Cottonwood is another big thing. Linden, sometimes people call them basswoods. Those are very popular as well. We've got two different kinds of birch that are native to the state. And then sort of moving into those trees that are on the coniferous side of things, we've got arborvitaes. A lot of people call them. Really, they're white cedars. We've got red cedars as well. And then particularly if you're going to, try to plant some new, wind blocks or something like that, pine spruces and firs are going to be what you typically think of as like your pine trees. So if you ever are going to get into kind of identifying these things, pine trees are going to have needles that come in clumps. Those clumps are called fascicles, and the number of needles in each clump is really important when you're trying to diagnose things. Spruces are going to have individual needles, but they're going to be really stiff. But you can still roll them between your fingers. They're going to be kind of roundish. Whereas firs tend to have flat needles, and you can't roll them. When you pull them off the tree, they don't roll. The other sort of way to kind of tell those two apart, spruces are spiteful, but firs are friendly. So if you bump into a spruce tree, you're going to know it, and you're probably not going to want to do that again. Fir trees, as long as you're wearing long pants, you're usually all right, and you can just sort of kind of sneak between them. But much beyond that, we're not going to get too far into it, because there's a lot of different options and varieties and species. And so, if you have a question about that, there's a lot of resources out there that can help you work through that. A couple other things that are sort of found in spotty locations throughout the state. Tamarack, some people call them larch trees. They will lose all their needles in the fall. That's completely normal. That's just how the tree works. Typically they're found in wetter areas and usually a little bit further north, but they are grown in some places. Bald cypress, this is the same cypress tree that you see down like in Florida and like in those like Louisiana swamps and that sort of thing. It's the same species. It's really hard. It just has a really big range. And we also have the hemlock, which is it's safe to have around. It's not toxic or anything like that. And it's a great tree to have. But the problem with it is that it is really valuable for wildlife food sources, and so it's really sort of difficult to get it to grow. It grows really slow, and it's slowly fading out in the landscape just because it's getting a lot of pressure and it struggles to survive. So now that we sort of have wrapped our mind around different kinds of trees, let's kind of move into, how do we take care of these trees? What are we supposed to do with all these, monster things that are in our neighborhoods? So if you're going to plant a tree, the first thing you need to look at is site selection. So this is really easy to do. Look at the tag, read the tag. Every nursery is going to have it, and it's going to give you all the information that you need. It's really simple, but it is super important. So that tag is going to tell you how much sunlight does this tree need? How much water does this tree need? Is this tree going to tolerate certain things? You know, black walnuts tend to discourage a lot of other plant growth around them. They have a chemical in their roots and in their leaves and their nuts. It's called jugulone, and it makes it very difficult for a lot of other plants to grow. Some trees can tolerate that chemical and other trees can't. So, you know, read the tag. How big is this thing going to get? You know, do you want to put this tree right next to your house? There are some trees that are pretty small and pretty manageable. And, you know, if you put them on the corner of your house, that's fine. And then there are other things that just don't belong right up next to the house. So those are all sort of questions to ask when you're at the nursery and you're looking for different species. When you get out and you're getting ready to plant, look around you. What's going on? Are we next to the house? Are we next to the driveway? Are we next to the sidewalk? Do we have power lines overhead? Do we have sewer lines underneath? You know, don't put a willow tree right by your septic system, because it's going to go to that water and it's going to cause all sorts of problems. You know, these are things that a lot of times people just put a plant in the ground and then, you know, a couple of years later, they're like, oh no, I've got all these problems. Well, a little bit of thinking beforehand can save you a lot of work later. And specifically in terms of managing street trees and things like that, you know, do you have permission to plant these trees or to manage the trees on this property? The right of way that is between the street and the sidewalk, that is the city's responsibility, and that's the city's, you know, land to manage. And that's not something where residents are just allowed to plant street trees. You know, there's a plan for that, and those sorts of activities are managed and paid for in other ways. And so, you know, is that your property? Once you get your tree in the ground, mulching is one of the most important things that you can do. It's really not complicated, but it is really critical to what's going on. You know, a lot of people ask me, do I need to buy the organic mulch? Does it need to be this kind of mulch? Anything that comes from like a natural source, whether it's pine bark or it's hardwood mulch or it's cedar mulch or it's wood chips from a tree company, whatever they happen to be, that's fine. If you get the stuff that's dyed in the different colors, that's okay. It's not a big deal. Just make sure that it's not a synthetic mulch. You don't want to use rubber tires. You don't want to use plastic mulch. That stuff doesn't break down. It doesn't hold moisture the right way. It doesn't sort of provide nutrients back into the soil. And if you ever want to try to clean it up, you can never get it all. You're always going to have little bits of rubber sort of in the ground, and it just becomes really complicated. Mulch, you want a thin, even layer. 3 to 4 inches thick is all that you need. You don't need to go any deeper than that. If you do go deeper than that, the tree is going to try to push roots up into that because it's going to think that it's soil, and you're just going to mess up all sorts of things on your tree. It's not going to like it, and it won't be helpful. The farther out you can mulch, the better off you'll be. But 12 to 18 inches is sort of a good minimum standard, because you need at least, you know, a gap so that you're not running into it, as you can see in this top picture, with equipment. You know, everybody's made the mistake. The mower deck got too close to the root flare, and now there's a big chunk missing out of my tree. Or, you know, there's grass that grows up on the side of this, and, you know, it doesn't look right. And so you go over and you're trying to weed, excuse me, you're trying to weed whip the grass, and then you weed whip a big line in the side of your tree. It's not good for the tree. It's not helpful. Just, you know, use mulch as a tool to keep the equipment away from that lower bit of bark. A lot of people like to sort of volcano the mulch up around the base of the trees. That is not good for your tree. that bottom area on the tree is really important for gas exchange. Those roots need to be able to get to that air a little bit. And so when you pile the mulch up, I've seen it sometimes 2 feet thick at the base of a tree. You're basically just burying it alive. It is really going to be problematic for the tree. That mulch is going to hold on to a lot of that moisture. And now you're just holding moisture around the base of your tree, which is going to be a great infection site for insects and fungus and bacterial diseases. All around, it just causes problems. So even if you wanted to, say, mulch around your tree, but leave an inch or two around the base of the trunk with no mulch and it was just dirt, totally fine. The best way that I can think of to kind of visualize what it is that you're shooting for, think about a tree in a forest. The whole forest floor is usually mulched with, last fall's leaves or, whatever downed material. And it's not piled up around the base of a trunk. So if you're trying to give the tree what it wants its natural sort of system. And so it's just a nice, thin, even layer of mulch all the way around. Oh, let's see here.
John, question, if we remove that mulch, will that hurt the tree if it has started forming roots?
Yes, but there is, if you want to take the time, there is a right way to do it. So when I worked in Florida, we had a lot of trees that were pine trees that just over time had accumulated a really thick layer of pine duff or like pine needles. And they'd started to root up into that, but it was a fire hazard. And so we needed to try to pull that pine duff away from the base of the trees. And what we were able to do is if we'd go out every couple of months, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and we just lightly rake whatever was sort of dry and loose off the top of the pile. We wouldn't dig, but as it sort of dried out and got fluffy and sort of broke off of like that main clump, we just sort of gently rake it back. And that gave the trees an opportunity to slowly push those roots back down instead of sort of throwing everything into shock by removing a lot of material at once. So if you sort of have, far too much mulch, just gently pull it away. If you've got 4 to 6 inches of mulch and you just want to reduce it a little bit, the easiest way to do it is just going to be to not mulch it for a couple of years and just let that mulch break down over time, and that layer will shrink and, just let it shrink down to where it wants to be on its own if you just have a little bit. But yeah, if you've got some monster pile of mulch, if you just put it on this summer and there aren't any roots in it, then absolutely this afternoon, if it warms up, hopefully it will, go out there and pull some of that mulch away. But yeah, if you've got roots in there, you want to be really careful because those feeder roots are going to be really sensitive, and you don't want to expose them to air too much, because once they get exposed to air, they're going to die if they're left that way. So you want to just sort of gently pull it back and let the tree kind of work at its own pace.
John?
Yes.
I have kind of the opposite question. We have a tree, it's probably about 60, 70 years old, that is on the water, and we need to fill in the property with dirt. How far back should we keep the dirt from the base of the tree? I mean, we've got to raise the level like maybe 3 inches or so. Will that affect the growth of the tree? Will that hurt the tree if we cover the roots that much?
Do you know what kind of a tree it is? Is it a willow?
No, the willow died. It's a maple, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, you're going to want to be careful that you don't sort of bury it. In most of like the root zone, you should be all right as long as you're not bringing in super heavy equipment and sort of compacting the ground. But I would avoid, do you know about how big around it is at the base?
Oh, it's probably the circumference is probably about 8 feet or so, 10 feet. It's a huge tree.
Okay. Then, yeah, I would probably stay back, I don't know, maybe whatever the width of that tree is, maybe stay back that far and then kind of start changing the grade. So it's probably always going to be in a low spot. But
Okay.
if you add soil right up to the base of the tree, a lot of times that's going to, really freak it out. That's not a natural thing. Trees, when they start growing, they sort of have all their eggs in one basket, and like that spot that they picked needs to stay good. And so, yeah, if you stay back sort of the diameter of the tree, you should be all right in terms of kind of what you need to do. But absolutely, I would make sure that whatever you use to bring it in there, you'd probably be all right with wheelbarrows and things like that. But if you're going to be driving a dump truck through or something like that, you're going to get compaction issues. And a lot of times that's going to make it really hard for those trees to get through that soil and to continue functioning the way that they intended.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And John, can I ask about, so I have two maples. I've been told they're King Crimson, which I think are Norway, right?
Yep.
Both on the right of way in my yard, and the last few years they've really been pushing up. I think they're, maybe they're hitting clay or something. So the root balls, or I would, at least that's my uneducated view, is like, you're seeing like the root ball, they look terrible because you're seeing all the whole root system kind of pushing up out of the ground on both of them. It's pushing up the sidewalk now. So this past year, to kind of make it look better, I did put mulch around the one. I don't know how, I got to think about how much I put on there, but I know I didn't necessarily follow this. So I guess there's a lot of questions there. Like, are my maples okay because they're pushing up? Should I do something about them? And what can I do about the mulch I did put down?
So maples are sort of notorious for having really shallow root systems. And as those roots grow and swell, oftentimes they are going to sort of break the surface of the soil. That's a normal part of how they work. And that's very common. And unfortunately, that's just part of having a really pretty top, is that a lot of times the roots don't always behave as the way that we would like. In terms of mulching, you should be all right in mulching over those roots, provided that you stay within the 3 to 4 inch range. If you've really overdone it, and you only mulched this year, then absolutely you should be fine to go out there and kind of smooth that out and spread it out. That's not really something that would worry me. It's not going to be able to push a whole bunch of roots up in a single growing season. This is, the root problem tends to come when they're, mulched that way season after season after season. And then somebody comes in and, this tree for the last 10 years has been trying to push those roots up to get that gas exchange. And then all of a sudden, the ground is gone again. And it just, they don't always know how to respond well. But
and there used to be grass under that tree, under the one especially. The other one still has grass around it, and that was the other reason why I wanted to mulch, just because it wasn't, it just, the whole mound was just dirt and kind of ugly and roots, and then I may have screwed up, because the other thing I did was I have another section of my yard that has a bunch of ivy, so I replanted some of the ivy under there, hoping that it would kind of fill in over time, and I don't care about there not being grass. I just didn't want a big, dirt pile. Just dirt. Is the ivy gonna cause problems or no?
So the ivy generally should be all right. Having been tasked with trying to manage ivy in the past, I'm always a little skeptical of it, because ivy is very persistent and it's very hard to get rid of when you decide you don't want it anymore. It's very much a long-term commitment, but at this point, sounds like you are aware of that part of the ivy. And so as long as you don't let it climb and sort of wrap around things and choke them out, the ivy shouldn't cause any problems. Particularly with Norway maples, whether they are, standard Norway maples or they're the King Crimson varieties. they're gonna create a lot of shade, and that shade is typically going to be very difficult for the grass to survive under. And so oftentimes the grass underneath the Norways is not doing well. It gets really sparse, it gets really spotty, and then next thing you know, it's just a lot of dirt. So yeah, if you have ivy and you are willing to sort of deal with the repercussions of the ivy in, you know, a few years, then that is a really great option if you want something that's green around the base of the trees instead of just dirt. So no, I'm not really worried about the ivy at all. If it starts growing too far up the tree, you know, ivy is a really easy thing to sort of manage in that respect, because you just go out there with a pair of pruners and you just snip all the stems all the way around, and everything on the top will die out and it'll stop being a problem. So at least in that respect, vines are usually pretty easy to manage when they're in trees. As long as you get them, you know, before you've got, you know, 30 feet of vines, it's way up in the middle of nowhere, and then you got all this, you know, dead brown stuff hanging. Like, don't let it get that bad. But once it starts to climb, you know, just sort of keep it pruned where you want it, and everything should be fine.
Great, thank you so much.
John, I have a question in the chat box. What's the safe distance between a willow tree and a septic system tank?
So the easiest way to do it, the research has shown that tree roots can extend up to twice the height of the tree away from the base. Willow trees are inherently shallow rooted because they're meant to be growing near bodies of water, and you know, roots don't do well when they're submerged all of the time. And so typically, you know, those willow tree roots, they're not going to go deep, they're just going to go sideways, and they can go a long way. You know, willow trees can get pretty tall. So generally speaking, if you've got a willow, I would try to push it as far away from the septic as you can get. Tree roots, research has shown, are not able to puncture a solid pipe. So if you have a pipe that is, you know, structurally sound, whether it's a water line or it's a sewer line or something like that, that's, you know, running from your house to the street, tree roots aren't going to, you know, seek out that pipe and then punch through it and cause problems. When you hear about roots in your pipes, your pipes were old, or they were already cracked, or there was something going on, and that root got in there and it just made the problem worse. But you know, that's not a septic system. A septic system has a lot of holes in it. It is intentionally a pipe that is made to leak. And so yes, in a situation like a septic system, willow trees are going to cause a lot of havoc, and it depends on the size of the tree and kind of how you're managing it. But generally speaking, on something like that, I would say the appropriate distance is as much as you can get on your property, because willows are just notorious for causing problems, and septic problems are a nightmare to try to deal with. So I know that's not probably the best answer or the answer that you were looking for, but that's the best that I've got.
Thank you. And then Trisha has her hand raised.
Yes, Trisha.
Hi, how are you? I have a white spruce that I got when my daughter graduated 5th grade. It was just a tiny little sapling, and we planted it in a not ideal location. It's like too close to my fence line. It's probably about 4.5 feet tall now. Can I transplant it safely to a better spot?
How long ago did you put it in the ground?
Well, I put it in the ground when she was in 5th grade, but I put it in a really bad spot where it didn't get enough sun. And so then I moved it, I'd say probably to where it is now, maybe 2 years ago, but I didn't allow for how big it's going to get. So it's
So the way to gauge how much root ball you're supposed to take when you're transplanting something is for every inch of diameter of tree you have at the base, you're supposed to take 10 inches of soil. So if you've got like a 4-inch tree, you're supposed to take, you know, like a 3.5 foot root ball to try to move. It's possible. You know, if you did want to try to move it, I would absolutely say, you know, get as much soil as you can, and, you know, try to get it up, maybe, you know, drag it like up on like a piece of plywood or up on a tarp or something like that, so that you can sort of slide it, because it's going to be far too much material that you're going to want to move to try to just like carry it or move it by hand. Certainly you could probably get in, you know, like a landscape company or something like that that might have a tree spade. And certainly if you had equipment like that, you could easily move it with a tree spade without too much trouble. But you know, once they get to be that size, certainly I would suggest this is going to be a bit of a project if you're going to try to move it, because if you're going to try to move, you know, a basketball sized root ball, that's just not going to be enough roots to support that much tree above ground, and it's probably not going to make it.
Okay, so I gather I'll just leave that for the professionals then.
That would be my suggestion.
Okay.
Having done it before, I know that that's going to be a lot of project and a lot of sweat. So
Okay.
not to say that it can't be done, but that's going to be a bit of an undertaking.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So in terms of fertilizing and irrigation, typically established trees don't need fertilizer. They don't usually have a lot of nutrient needs that aren't being met. If you think that you might have some sort of a deficiency, the easiest way to find out, Michigan State University offers a soil test. It's $25. It's really easy to do. You can get one at your extension office for the county, or I'm sure that you can go online to Michigan State, and there's a way that you can probably order one with COVID and everything else. I'm sure that they've tried to automate that. And you go out, you take a couple of scoops of soil from different areas around your tree. Don't just get, you know, one spot, test several. You put it in a bag, you kind of mix it up, and then you fill up the soil test sample thing, and you send it into Michigan State, and they will email you back your results, and they will tell you the pH of your soil, and they will tell you, you know, how much you have of each of the micronutrients and each of the macronutrients, and you can sort of put in there what you're trying to grow, whether you're doing a flower garden or a vegetable garden, or you're doing grass or trees or whatever it is. And it'll tell you, you know, this is in the range that it's supposed to be, and this is in the range that it's supposed to be, and this is too high or that's too low. It's very user friendly. It's very easy to do. But typically trees don't have a lot of these problems. Usually if your tree is having an issue, it is from something that is beyond what the soil issues. Sometimes it could be a pH problem because you have, you know, a new crushed concrete driveway or road salt or too much water, something like that. But it's not usually, you know, my tree has a, you know, some weird nutrient deficiency thing. So generally speaking, fertilization is not really a problem. Irrigation is a much larger problem for trees. The best thing that you can do in terms of watering your tree is, as you can see in the diagram, you want to water kind of out at the edge of where you think that the roots are, which typically would mean the edge of the tree canopy. Trees don't absorb water through the trunk, so it doesn't do any good to water the trunk of the tree. It really just creates a way for disease to get in. So it is best to keep the water off the trunk as best you can, and just water out along the edge of that drip line. The other tidbit that I would add in here that is super important, a lot of people have blue spruce in their yard, in their landscape, but the longer name is a Colorado blue spruce. Blue spruces are intended to grow in the mountains of Colorado. It's a very dry environment. They do not need a lot of water. And in an area like ours, in a climate like ours, naturally, they get tons of water and they get a lot of diseases because of it. So spruce trees in particular, blue spruce trees, you really need to watch how much water you're putting on there. And if you have an irrigation system that is just blasting water inside of your blue spruce, that water is just going to sit there. It's really hard to dry out the inside of a spruce. And you really tend to get a lot of disease issues, fungus issues. Needle cast is a huge problem in blue spruce. And they start to get big. They just sort of start to come into their own. And then they start to deteriorate and decline. So, absolutely make sure that you're watering your trees, particularly if it's a freshly planted tree. So, Tricia, if you are going to decide to move that spruce, absolutely, you want to make sure that, right after transplant, that tree is getting lots and lots of water, because transplant shock is a big problem. And you're going to want to make sure that probably for a year or two, maybe even 3 growing seasons, you keep that tree well watered. But, if you're looking out at your established, oak trees or your maple trees along the street, like those trees are not going to be typically candidates for intensive fertilizing programs or supplemental irrigation unless we're in, a record drought.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have some maple street trees, and they suffer from chlorosis. And I've seen that from other maple street trees, both here and in neighboring cities. The city for a while tried injections of iron, didn't seem to make much of a difference. Is there anything we can do to help improve the situation?
Chlorosis, there are some things that you can do, and typically that would be when you'd run into a candidate for fertilization or for an iron injection or something like that. But oftentimes, sort of like with us, before you can really start working on the disease, you need to stop causing the problem. And unfortunately, street trees are just in a spot where it's really hard to sort of fix that problem. So they're surrounded by pavement, typically on 2 sides, if not more. You've got the street and the sidewalk, and they get salted all winter. And then in the summertime, they just get cooked. And so, certainly I would agree that iron injections are probably an appropriate treatment, but at the same time, the right of way of a street is just not a forest. And so those trees are always going to struggle.
Okay. That makes sense why the treatments didn't seem to really help. And it explains a lot of what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. And at the same time, without being able to be there and look at it, I don't want to say that the treatments didn't help, because the treatments very likely prevented a lot more damage that would have happened had the treatments not occurred. And so to some extent, there may still be some value in that. But unfortunately, the average lifespan of a street tree is about 40 years. And, a red oak out in a woodlot could live 200 or 300 years. So you just kind of got to keep in mind that that's just a really harsh environment, and that those trees tend to really struggle to become the big, beautiful, iconic park trees that everybody kind of wishes they had in their front yard. So as an industry, we haven't really come up with a great solution to that, because we still want street line trees and we still have to salt in the wintertime. So I wish that I had a better answer, but yeah, that's really a tough one to try to solve.
Are there trees that you would recommend then for street trees that fare better?
So yes and no. It all depends on where you're at. So, if you are looking at a street where you've got lots of space and you have, the power line runs on the other side of the road, then, you know, you have a different list of candidates than you do if the power line is on your side of the road and you need to pick something that's short. If you have a street tree that is, you know, on a south facing slope, that's going to have very different conditions than a street tree on a north facing slope. And so, you know, generally speaking, there's no good sort of one size fits all option. And the best thing that I can say is that when you're looking at a landscape, or, you know, in our case, an urban forest, the most important thing you can do is plant for diversity. So if you find something that works, don't stick with it and keep putting in the same thing. You know, that's kind of what happened back in the 70s when they were planting elm trees, and then we got Dutch elm disease, and like the city of Flint lost whole streets worth of street trees, and there was nothing they could do about it because they only had elms. And so you need to make sure that you've got, you know, trees that are suitable for that location, but also if we get some weird pest that comes in from Europe or Asia or wherever, we need to make sure that if we lose a species of tree, we're still going to have something left. So I'm usually very hesitant to sort of throw out a good answer, because you need to have a lot of good answers, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a lot of perfect answers, but you need to have multiple good answers in order to have a sustainable street tree landscape moving forward.
I can address some of this. I'm the city council liaison to the tree board, and we have a number of the tree board members here, and they do a lot of work selecting a list of street trees that fill different niches, and also to make sure that we have diversity in the city. For example, we have stopped offering maples because we have too many maples as street trees, and for the reasons you mentioned, if some disease comes through, we don't want to lose all of our trees. So yeah, we have different trees for different situations, and when someone in the city signs up for a tree, the city tries to select a tree that would be best for that location, depending on the room you have and, you know, what's in the surrounding environs.
Yes. The general rule of thumb for sort of trees in an urban landscape, it's called the 10-20-30 rule. So you don't want to have 10% of your urban forest be a single species. You don't want to have more than 20% being in a single genus, and more than 30% being in a single family. So that kind of gets into kind of the scientific classifications of things, but really it's sort of geared towards putting numbers to the idea behind biodiversity, and, you know, just mix it up and have a variety of different shapes and sizes and species, and, you know, just keep things kind of fluctuating and moving around. And then if something happens, even if it's something as simple as they need to redo the street, and so they have to come through, and, you know, you have a species that's really sensitive to soil disturbance, you know, instead of losing every tree on the street, you only lose one or two. And yeah, it's unfortunate, and no, I'm not happy about it, but it's a lot better than losing everything. So I'm really glad to hear that you guys have that list and that you're updating it. And most municipalities that I know of have too many maple trees, but I don't know that too many of them have taken the proactive step to say, we're not going to put any more maples in. So that's really good to hear. So I do appreciate that. And from somebody that, you know, works in the field, that makes me really happy to know. So good work.
Thank you.
John,
Yes.
Sorry.
I have a question in the chat box. Why does it seem so many fir and or evergreen trees are turning brown and dying?
I don't know exactly what the answer is to that. There's probably a combination of things. Oftentimes, those things tend to be particularly sensitive to winter exposures and to salt exposures and things like that. And so, especially in an urban landscape, they tend to get hit the hardest and are the easiest to sort of see as being damaged and moving into decline. So I don't know of any instances where they are being negatively impacted more than most other things. It might just be like a perception thing, but I'm not exactly sure. And I think we had one more question. Nope. Okay.
Yes, yes,
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
yes. Can I go back to the red oak? Is the yearly maintenance for the red oak, the soil drain and the fertilizer, is it necessary?
No. So in most situations, established trees are not going to need any of this stuff. Trees do a very good job of maintaining their own environments quite well. Also trees tend to, when you look at its succession and when you look at a forest, trees do just fine in out competing most everything else. So, if you're trying to plant flowers underneath a tree, they're going to have a really hard time competing with that. They're probably going to not get as much water as they want. They're probably not going to get the nutrients that they want, because that tree is just better at collecting it and taking it up faster than a lot of the other types of vegetation. So generally speaking, trees don't need a lot of supplemental help unless they are newly planted or unless we have some catastrophic weather event. If we have, a drought like what California is experiencing, that might be a reason to start thinking about trying to do, extra irrigation. But if we have a drought that's that bad, we're probably not going to want to be spending our water on street trees, because we're going to need it for other, vital uses. And so typically I do not recommend fertilizing or irrigation for trees unless there is very unique circumstances.
What about for the cankers?
For the cankers, so again, that's a unique situation that I'm hesitant to provide any recommendations on without being able to actually go out there and kind of walk around it and take a look at it. So that's probably the point where I would say you should contact a professional arborist or a tree service, and have them come out and give you an opinion and an assessment on the ground.
Yeah, that's what I have been using. A company that they have recommended that doing the soil drainage
Yes.
for the canker.
Yep. That
that's
sounds reasonable
appropriate.
to me.
So that's appropriate, right?
Yes,
Okay.
that would be appropriate. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. So from here, let's sort of jump into pruning and talk about that for a minute. So pruning is kind of the part that everybody gets into. It's where you really get to see big changes in a short amount of time, but there's lots of things that you shouldn't do when you're pruning. First and foremost, this top picture here on the left, this was in my neighbor's yard, and no part of this is appropriate. He has an aluminum extension ladder that he's leaned on the power lines. Everything about this is bad. Do not prune from a ladder. Industry-wide, we do not use ladders in the tree care industry unless we are just trying to get into the tree. The first thing that I do is I tie in from the ground. I might use the ladder to help me climb up, but then my guys get the ladder out of the way, and it is not a tool that I use. Don't cut from a ladder. All around, ladders are a bad idea. We sort of have a running joke in the industry that I will try to share here if I can. So on my helmet for work, we have a sticker that says "Caution Ladders." That's all it says. Ladders are just a bad idea. When you're standing on a ladder, that usually means that you're trying to cut from the ladder, and whatever you're going to cut is going to fall. It's going to clip the ladder. No, it's just a bad idea. If you need a ladder to do it, then generally speaking, it's probably beyond the scope of what you have the equipment to handle and should be taken care of in a different way. Don't leave stubs. If you guys look over here, this is a tree stump. This is still in the ground, and you guys can see there's this little nub right here. So this tree was a hemlock, and I didn't realize that this stub was here. I just happened to get really lucky when I felled it. And so this used to be a branch that for whatever reason broke off, and it never got cleaned up. And so the tree just sort of over time grew out in rings, and it grew around it. And this little piece of wood, this dead branch that never broke off, was just sealed inside the trunk of that tree for 20 or 30 years. Stubs never go away. They're just sort of there. They're hazardous. If you walk into them, they hurt. They're unsightly. They don't need to be there. If you're gonna prune a limb, prune it all the way back to where it should go. That stub is never going to grow out, and if it does start to resprout, those sprouts aren't going to be good sound branches the way that we would like. If you're going to be pruning, you need to make sure that you don't over prune your tree in a single season. So on most trees, 25% of the canopy is all that you should be taking off. If you take more than that, you're going to cause stress to the tree, and it could cause the tree to die. The leaf area, that's where the tree gets its food. And if you take half of its food away, it's probably going to starve to death. Fruit trees are a little bit different. They sort of function differently. And there you can take up to 50% of the canopy because they do want a lot of that increased airflow. But on oaks, maples, beeches, birches, hickories, crab apples, red buds, those sorts of things, 25% is the limit. Also, there's no reason to be painting all of your cuts unless you're protecting against a specific pest or disease or something like that. So if you are pruning on an oak tree and you know that oak wilt's a problem, then absolutely use the wound paint and seal those things up. But if it's just, I'm cutting and so I want to be able to seal this up, usually it causes more problems than it saves, because you can have issues with, water kind of getting up underneath there and causing rot. If the paint starts to blister or peel or something like that, you can get a little pocket in there that holds moisture. And then on top of that, it's sort of, you're adding a foreign substance to this tree, and we don't know all of the different things that could potentially be doing. So unless there's a good reason to do it, it's usually not worth doing it just proactively. So now that we've had that, let's talk about some pruning do's. So when you're going to prune, you want to make sure that you prune back to a node. This means that you won't be leaving stubs. So the idea behind it is that when you're pruning, you want to take it back to one of these growth points. You don't want to leave this stick right here. So if we cut right here and we just cut this node off, then we'd have this stub that doesn't have a growth point, so it doesn't really know what to do, but it can't just fall off on its own. Like the tree can't just break it off. So cut where this yellow line's at, so you have a growth point that comes out of here, and it can keep growing normally without having, you know, some weird defect thing sticking out the side. And be really conscious of this when you're pruning. Have a reason. I've seen a lot of situations where, you know, I'm pruning because I don't know, because I think the tree needs pruning. Like, are we trying to shape it? Are we trying to reduce the size? Are we trying to raise the canopy? Do we have a limb that's off balance, or a limb that's, you know, growing somewhere that I don't want it to grow? There's a lot of reasons to prune, but make sure that you have a goal in mind and you're not just cutting to cut. So for instance, in this photo here, you can see all these old growth points on these trees at the bottom. And all of these growth areas are, these are old pruning cuts. But what happened was they just shaped this tree. They took off way more than they should have, and they didn't cut it back to a node. And so you just get these explosions of growth at the tips of these branches. And in the summertime, it's sort of covered up with leaves and you can't really tell. And as long as you don't do it for a living, it looks fine. But in the wintertime, it just looks goofy. And so, you know, if you're going to go out pruning, you know, make sure that you know what it is you want to end up with, and, you know, have a destination that you're trying to get to instead of just going out to drive around. The other really important thing to keep in mind is branch unions. So how do the branches come together? This is super important in terms of the structural integrity of the tree and the strength of what's going on. So when you look at a branch union like this one here on the left, the branch is coming right straight out of the tree at almost a 90-degree angle. This is really strong. So trees, they have two types of growth. They have growth lengthwise where they're expanding and they're stretching out, and then they have sideways growth where they're expanding and they're adding rings of material, and every year that trunk or that limb is going to swell. And in this situation, you know, this vertical trunk is going to get bigger and bigger every year, and this stem is going to get bigger and bigger every year. But that's okay, because they're not pressing against each other. In this situation here, this larger stem is getting wider and wider and wider, and so is this smaller one. It's getting wider and wider. And this crack right here, this fissure, every year has more and more pressure as those two pieces are prying themselves apart, because they're trying to add more layers of wood in between themselves. And that's what leads to the third picture. At some point, they're going to add so many layers of wood that you're going to get so much pressure, something's got to give, and you're going to have a failure. So these really narrow, what are called branch unions, these are not very structurally strong unions. These ones that are more 90 degrees, these are a lot better. Sometimes these ones will look more like a U shape. This branch will come out and then it'll start to curl up. That's fine as long as you've got that good U shape. The V-shaped branch angles, those ones are the ones that you really need to try to manage. And it is better to manage them when they're small than it is to wait until they get really big, because at that point, it usually becomes a project to have a professional company come in and try to mitigate that, because there's just too much material. So understanding branch unions can really go a long way. And if you see, if you get a new maple tree and it's, 5 or 6 feet tall, and you get a branch angle like that, and you can go out with a pair of hand pruners and you can just snip off, whichever one you don't like. Usually that's the smaller one. That tree can grow around it and it can heal, and it's no big deal. But, a lot of times we get calls and the tree's 40 or 50 feet tall and there's this really narrow branch angle, and that becomes a pretty involved project to try to clear up. So, taking care of it sooner rather than later is definitely the way to go. Epicormic branching. This, you can see there's these really little branches that come out from this much larger branch. these branches, the way that they're formed, they're just sort of like secondary growth that comes off after that branch has been formed. These aren't one of those nodes that we were talking about earlier. And so they're not anchored all the way into the center of the branch. They just sort of start on the outside and just sort of take off. Usually this is a sign of stress. This comes after you've taken off a big branch. You might get some growth that just sort of comes out of that pruning cut or something like that. They're not really strong branches. They're not going to be things that are going to typically last a very long time. And so, you know, don't use these branches as like a place that you can cut back to, or think that they're going to be like another layer of the canopy coming back out, because that's typically just not the case. When you're pruning, you want to prune it right back to the branch collar. The easiest way to see that, these pictures are all from a beech tree. And I use a beech tree only because it's a really great example, because it's just really got smooth bark that's easy to see. So you can see there's these ridges right here, these kind of wrinkles in the bark. That's the branch collar. This here, you've got this sort of textured area. Again, that's the branch collar. And then this one, there's this really well-defined ridge. They're all going to be, this is all the branch collar. They're just different examples of it. And so when you cut, you'd want to make sure that you cut just outside of that. You don't want to impact this branch collar area, because that's going to be the part that seals over the wound. So trees don't heal. They don't have that ability. What they do is they compartmentalize things, and then they grow over it and pretend like it didn't happen. So oftentimes, if you're going to leave, you know, if you were to cut this way out here, this tree is going to have to grow all the way out and then over this before it can, you know, kind of move past it. So you don't want to leave this big stub, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to impact this branch collar area that is going to be the part that would kind of grow over it. So you want to go just outside of that branch collar, and then try to make sure that everything is cleaned up and clear for the tree to just sort of move on. So that's really the best that I can explain it without, you know, really kind of taking people out and doing a hands-on workshop. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that the cut that you're making leaves the smallest wound possible. So, you know, on something like this one in the middle here, you're probably going to leave a little bit of a shoulder on this limb. It'll stick out a little bit. That's okay. Because if you were to cut straight down, instead of having a small circle, you'd end up with a big oval, and you're going to have a lot more surface area that's got the potential to rot or to get infected with something. So you're trying to minimize the size of the wound while at the same time not leaving a really big stub. When you're pruning, it's really important that you use the 3-cut method. Everybody's seen sort of like this top picture, these wounds where a limb came off and, you know, it peeled way down the trunk and it's missing a whole bunch of bark and it's just really unsightly. It's not good for the tree. So the best way to do it is to identify the branch collar where you want to cut, and then go outside of that a ways. It can be anywhere from a couple of inches to 1.5 feet. And you want to make your undercut. And what that's doing is you want to cut through the bark about 1/3 of the diameter of the tree. So sometimes that means that you're going to just sort of take it could be a handsaw. If you're very confident, if you have the tools and you have the ability, it could be a chainsaw, but chainsaws are inherently dangerous. Don't operate one unless you're comfortable. But you're trying to sever that bark, that live tissue on the bottom, so that when the top of the limb finally breaks, it's not going to be able to peel. So this undercut, you're really not trying to reduce the structural integrity of the limb. You're just trying to make it not peel. And then the second cut, you're going to come down further out, so that when it does kind of get to where your undercut's at, the whole thing will just break off. And then the last cut, is going to be straight through from the top to the bottom along the edge of the branch collar, but there's no weight out there, so you don't need to worry about that limb breaking off and peeling the bark all the way down the tree. When you're pruning, the easiest way that I've found to do it to make sure that you don't take too much is to pile the material up next to the tree. Then you can stand back and you can look and you can say, okay, the pile's getting kind of big. That looks like it's about a quarter of the canopy area. We're gonna have to be done for now. You know, cut back slowly. If you need to cut back a limb and then you cut it back again and maybe even a third time, that's okay. But once you know, if you take it all the way back to the trunk and then you've got a big hole, you're kind of stuck. So, you know, even when we prune, I'll cut the same limb 2 or 3 times to make sure that we've pruned it back just to where we want and we haven't overshot. If you have more pruning than can be done in a single season, that's okay. Oftentimes it does take a little while to get your trees back in order. If you've purchased a new property or something like that, you can prune over multiple years, but you don't want to overdo it and prune all of it at once. And pruning is absolutely easier if you have a second person to just stand back and say, yeah, that looks good. Or, you know, you shake a branch and they're like, ooh, no, that's just going to leave a really big hole. Yeah, that probably needs to go, but we can't take that one because, you know, the aesthetics of the tree just won't let us. So keep that in mind and be ready to sort of take your time and do it very thoughtfully. The other thing to keep in mind is that you can prune in the wintertime. That's called dormant pruning. It's totally fine. The tree's fine with it. If you're going to prune in the summertime, you want to make sure that the tree's had time to, you know, push its leaves and to sort of generate a little bit of energy, because growing all new leaves every year is a lot of work on those trees. But you also don't want to prune, you know, right before the leaves fall off, because the trees are still trying to pull whatever resources they can back out of those trees. And then the last point that I have here, you know your limits and be ready to hire a professional if the project calls for it. You know, tree care and the tree care industry is very much like any other trade. You know, sure, if you need to, you know, change out a light switch in your house, that's fine. But when it comes to rewiring the whole, you know, fuse box, that is beyond me, and I'm okay with that. You know, when you get to a project that is beyond what you have the tools or the equipment for or the resources for, you know, make sure that you get somebody that can do it and can do it safely, both for you and for you know, the health of the tree. So we're gonna kind of move into hazard trees here real quick, and then we'll wrap up.
Can I ask one question about pruning?
Yep, certainly.
I've always heard not to prune more than a third at a time. Is that like per growing season? I mean, can I cut back a third now and then in a year later cut back? I mean, if something is way overgrown?
Yes. Yeah. So that would be the third at a time rule would be per year, right? So okay. I would say that's per calendar year and not really like per season, because I wouldn't say that you should take a third in the summer and then take a third like the following winter, because that's going to be pretty catastrophic. But certainly, you know, from one summer to one summer or one winter to one winter, the 25% or the third should be all right.
Can I ask a quick question about suckers, you know, of like pear trees or fruit trees? Is there anything that can be done about those? The suckers come off the roots?
You can go out there with a pair of clippers and you can just sort of clip them off.
That's what I do.
Beyond that, there's not a lot of great options. Unfortunately, that's just how some trees are. Also, a lot of times pear trees and apple trees will get what are called water sprouts. And basically it's the same thing, but they just sucker off the limbs and they grow straight up in the air. Those two can be pruned off with a pair of hand pruners. I've heard of some people trying to, you know, paint them over or things like that. It's not good for the trees. Really, you're better off to just, you know, go out there and kind of pull back the soil a little bit so that you're cutting kind of below grades. This way you don't see the little stubs, but yeah, it's just
Okay, that's what I do. Okay, just
a little
checking.
bit of love.
All right,
Yep.
thank you.
Yes. So, hazard trees. So, a hazard tree is a tree that has some sort of a defect that increases the likelihood for a failure, where that failure can lead to damage. So, things that would be a red flag and that would, you know, signal that we might have some structural defects would be things like codominant stems. So you've seen, and a lot of times this happens in like silver maples, where it'll grow up and you'll have sort of two branches that are competing to be the leader. And so they're both growing basically straight up. They're right together. That branch union is going to be really a tight V. You'll see a lot of bark that'll kind of grow down in like what used to be like the bottom of that branch union. And there's a lot of pressure between those two stems. And eventually one of them is going to win out because of the pressure that builds up between there. And this one, you know, is going to break off and this one is going to be the leader. But until then, you don't know which side's going to fail. It's another reason to go up there and try to manage those things early, before there's an opportunity for that to happen. If you have dieback in the crown, if you have gaps in the crown, if you have discoloration like chlorosis in the street trees, like we were talking about a little earlier, if it's leaning and it's got broken roots, if it's got mounded or cracked soil, things like that going on at the base, you know, those are all reasons to think that, you know, maybe in that storm last week, you know, one of the big structural roots broke and now it's starting to lean and it doesn't have that same foundational support that it used to. If you have branches that extend way beyond the canopy, you know, sometimes you'll see a tree and it's got this beautiful shape to it, and then it's got one arm that just sticks way out in the middle of nowhere and it's way off balance. Injuries, if you see broken branches, if you see scars on the trunk, if there's damage to the base of the tree. I know we had a street tree up in Flint that had been hit by a car like 20 years before that, before we were called out. And up until that point, it had looked pretty good. I mean, yeah, there was a big kind of wound on the base of the trunk, but it looked all right. And we did some tests and we found out that the middle of the tree was basically hollow. There wasn't really anything left. And it was 30 or 40 inches around. It was a monster oak tree. Some other things you can look at would be abnormalities in the trunk, the root flare and the root zone. So if it's got a lot of, you know, big bends in it, that can be, you know, something to look a little bit closer at. If it doesn't have a root flare, if the trunk of the tree goes straight into the ground, oftentimes that's a sign that you have girdling roots. So a tree trunk should come down and where it meets the ground, it should sort of flare out a little bit and you should see the roots moving out into the soil. If it grows straight down, usually what happened is below the level of the soil, there's a root that is wrapped around the bottom of that tree and the tree is swelling and so is that root and they're just choking each other out. And so if you don't have a root flare, that is definitely a concern. If there's something weird going on in the root zone, if they're, you know, putting in a new street and they've cut a lot of the roots, if you needed to trench to have a wire or a new pipe put underground, something like that. You know, those are all reasons to sort of look at a tree and maybe think a little bit harder about what's going on. So the other part of a target of a hazard tree are targets. If you don't have a target, you don't have a hazard. So people, property, or other items of value that can be impacted if that tree fails. You don't have a hazard tree out in the middle of the woods where nobody's at, because if it falls, nobody knows, and that's okay. You know, if you have a dead limb that's hanging over your house, you can't move your house. That's a high risk thing. Absolutely, like we need to take care of that. You know, if the same thing's going on over the driveway, but your car's only there half the time, then there's half the risk. You know, if you're looking at that same thing and it's out in the park and, you know, sure, maybe somebody might walk under that, maybe someday. Yeah, there's still maybe some risk there, but it is a much lower priority than something that's over a structure that we can't move. You know, in a situation like that, maybe the best thing to do is to, you know, caution tape it off and you just don't let anybody there. If there's a bench underneath it, move the bench. You know, that's sometimes the easiest way to mitigate some of these things. So let's take a look at some hazard trees and kind of work through that, and then we'll move into the reporting part. So this part here, I've found works best if we kind of have a discussion. So I've been talking a lot the last little bit. What do you guys see in this? Do you guys see any reasons to think that this tree might be a hazard?
Yeah, lots of V-shaped,
V-shape, yeah.
yeah, roots.
Yes. There's a
Every
lot of
branches.
very narrow branch angles. Yep. Do you guys see anything else?
And they're crisscrossing.
Yep. We got some crisscross branches. A little bit of stuff up here. Can you guys see my mouse when I point like this?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, then I guess I don't need to keep going back down to the laser pointer thing. Okay, that'll make it a little easier. So yeah, you know, you got some branches that are crossing, but generally speaking, this one doesn't look too bad, does it?
No.
Okay. Let's take a look at the next one. So what do you guys see here? Anything going on as far as reasons to be concerned?
Looks very overcrowded.
Yep. This one looks pretty overcrowded. There's
Competing
a lot
main
of stuff
branches.
going on. There's a lot of codominant stems. You've got a lot of stuff that's competing. You guys notice this down here? There's a driveway in this one. So now instead of just kind of being out in the middle of nowhere, this tree is along a driveway. So now we've introduced the idea of potentially having a target involved, whereas we didn't before. Do you guys see anything else? You know, we've got this branch here that's kind of out on its own, and you know, not way off balance, but it is a little bit weird, and you know, something that I might take a second look at. What about this third one? What do you guys see here?
Looks pretty off balance, like everything's on the one side of the trunk, if I can see that correctly.
Yes. Yep. And I know this picture is kind of tricky to see. I tried to get the whole tree in it. Yeah. So it's pretty off balance. Down here, there's actually a really big wound. This tree lost one of its main stems that sort of came out this way, kind of towards me when I was taking the picture. And so there's a huge scar at the bottom that's, you know, was cleaned up as best you can, but you know, it lost something like a quarter of its leaf area in a single event. So there's that. Also up here, you really can't see it in the picture, so I don't blame you guys for not catching it, but there's a cable in this tree that holds this limb kind of in with all the other ones. If there's a cable in a tree, that's absolutely, that means that somebody has already identified that this tree has a weak point. And so we've already accepted that this tree has a weakness, and we are trying to reduce some of that risk. So, yeah. Now, all three of those pictures were the same tree. So I make that point to say that if you have somebody come out and, you know, you have an arborist come out and they give you a bid from the truck and they never get out and take a walk around it, the likelihood that they've missed something important is very high. You know, there are a lot of municipalities where, you know, the budget says the best we can do is an assessment from the road. And so they're going to drive and they do the best that they can. But You know, if you have a tree that, you know, you think is a concern, if you're going to have somebody come out, absolutely, if they don't get out and sort of walk around and take a good look at it, that to me is a red flag that maybe that's not the guy that I want working on my tree, because there's a lot of things that you can miss, and it just, you really gotta be paying attention to what's going on. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of different ways that it can change. So this is the sugar maple that is on the Applewood estate. You can see this big limb here. This whole limb is about 1/3 of the canopy, and it's trying to separate. You can see there's this big crack right here. This is kind of a close up. You can actually take a yardstick and push this through the crack and out the other side. A few years ago, they had an arborist come out from New York who estimated that this limb on its own weighs about 15,000 pounds. It's a monster. You can see in the fall, the center of the tree loses all of its leaves before either one of the sides does. And absolutely 100%, this limb is hazardous. There's no way around it. You know, there's the potential for this to fail at almost any time. So, you know, what do? This tree is it's in a part of the estate where a removal is just not appropriate. It's a focal point on the front lawn. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on, and so the option was instead of you know, going in there and trying to remove it, the first thing they did was they just put a fence around it. They identified where the fall zone might be if this limb were to fail, and they just made sure that nobody was allowed to walk there. Yes, it's going to be really bad if that limb breaks, but it's not going to be able to hurt anybody. Worst case scenario, it's going to tear up a little bit of lawn. We can fix the grass. So they removed the target, which made it a much smaller hazard than it otherwise would have been. And then last year, what they did was they installed a propping system. So they actually put in 4 props that help to support the weight of this limb and reduce a lot of the force that comes back down to this branch union right here at the bottom. So there are a lot of different options, and you know, I say this to make the point that removals or severe pruning is not the only thing you can do. There are other options, but you know, you just need to be mindful and take into account what's going on before you get, you know, too far along in the process, because the first thing you need to do is identify it and try to mitigate the safety hazard. In terms of reporting trees, you know, why would you report a tree? You can report a tree because it's a hazard. You know, if there's a big dead limb hanging over the street, absolutely, that deserves a phone call. Somebody should take care of that. If you see a big dead limb hanging over your neighbor's house, you know, go knock on their door, go give them a call, you know, and let them know. Maybe they haven't seen it, but you know, those are definitely things that need to be addressed. If there's severe damage to the trunk, if you've got damage to the roots, or if you've got, you know, some of that soil disturbance near the base of the tree, if it's mounded, if it's cracking, things like that, you know, tell somebody about it if you think that could be a problem. The other reason is that if it's a visual obstruction, if it's blocking street lights, or if it's blocking a traffic sign, you know, sometimes I've seen where, you know, a limb is growing, and usually it's on the Norway maples. I don't mean to pick on them, but that's just usually what happens. And they like to grow in front of a stop sign. Like, that limb just can't be there, and we're going to have to prune that off because the stop sign needs to be seen. Another thing is that, you know, if it's growing into street lights, and, you know, you're not able to get the visibility on the street that you need, you know, that's something for the utility companies to be aware of, because that needs to be managed appropriately. You know, and when you're doing this, kind of the first thing to keep in mind is to figure out you know, who does it belong to? Who is it that I'm calling? If it's in the right of way, or if it's, you know, in like the median of a boulevard, that's going to be a call to, you know, the Department of Public Works. That's going to be a call to the city to let them know, hey, this is what's going on. As much as every city tries to, you know, watch out for those things, they can't be everywhere and looking at everything at once. And so sometimes as a resident, you know, you kind of need to step in and be the eyes and the ears a little bit and let them know what's going on. You know, if it's on a park property, that's a different department. It's still the city, but you know, that's going to be a different phone number. You know, private lots, something like that, you know, go talk to your neighbor. You know, if you have a tree that's growing on the property line, you both have shared ownership and it's equal ownership, regardless of, you know, if most of the trees on their side or your side, everybody gets an equal say in what happens. And this isn't always the easiest thing to do, but this is the opportunity to go make a neighbor. You go and you talk to them and you say, hey, here's the deal. You know, this tree, I think we need to do something about it. You know, talk to them. If you've got a limb that's hanging over just your side, you can prune. As long as you're making good pruning cuts, you can prune back to the property line. And you don't need to necessarily get, you know, permission from your neighbor to do that. But in terms of a removal or something like that, that absolutely needs to be a conversation that's had with everybody involved. The most complicated ones are the trees that grow like on the corner between 4 lots, because there's just a lot of people involved in that decision, and usually they get a little tricky. You know, you can see in the bottom of this picture here, it says like a land bank lot. So if you have a nonprofit or a business or something like that, you know, it needs to be acknowledged that, you know, that's a private entity of some sort, and you know, they're ultimately responsible for that land, and you know, they need to be contacted before you just go over there, you know, because it's the shrub border that, you know, got put up behind, you know, this office thing, and it borders a corner of my yard. That doesn't mean that because somebody doesn't live there, they don't have a say in it. So just make sure that you're respecting everybody else's, you know, property, but also at the same time, you know, if something is really bad and you don't seem to be able to get any traction with a neighbor, City of Berkley Community Development Department can help you out in those sorts of situations as well. So this is actually the policy from the city of Flint. This is something that is generally pretty universal as far as what you know cities are trying for, but you know, this is just something to keep in mind, that you know, street tree policies are always going to be, you know, designed with public safety in mind, and public safety coming first. And it's not so much a matter of aesthetics as much as we try to make it that. You know, first and foremost, Public Works is trying to do their job of making sure that the city infrastructure is intact. You know, the street tree maintenance process for the city of Berkley, this is the phone number that they can be reached at, or that is their email address. And according to the city, Hart Urban Forestry is the current city contractor, and they're the ones that will be working with the city to assess the trees and to get that management work done. So if you guys have specific things in mind, or if you guys have specific questions, that is the contact information for those folks for street trees. Park trees, they're going to be very similar to street trees. They're going to run out of a different budget, but the process is generally going to be the same, and their contact information is listed there. So that's that. This is my contact information. If you guys have any questions, or if you guys would like further information or something like that, you know, feel free to send me an email, to give me a call, something like that. You know, I'm happy to help with whatever's going on where I can.
Do we get, is there a possibility to get your slideshow Mailed to us or anything, or?
That would be a question for Matt over at the library. I don't have any problem with that, but he's the one that has all that information and the logistics. So
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
100%, John. If you want to email me your presentation, I'm happy to send that out to everyone.
okay.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yep, I can do that.
And the
It was
post,
excellent.
yes,
Thank you,
agreed.
thank
It was great to hear. You're clearly very passionate and knowledgeable about this subject. So thank you, John. The post-event survey is in the chat box right now. If everyone wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that, that would be a big help.
And this is
Thank you
Kathy
very
Carlos. I just want to let you know that I also put in the chat box a link to a guide for trees in Berkeley that was put together by graduate assistants in the program at MSU for Department of Forestry. So if you're interested in identifying and seeing the variety of trees that we currently have in Berkeley, take a look at that link.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting and informative.
You're welcome.
I have a question on the survey. If we can't do it right now, can we come back to it a little later today?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
It's only a couple of questions, but that'll be posted for a few days. So
Okay.
you got plenty of time.
I can include the survey links in my email that I send out with John's presentation.
Okay. Thank you. It was very informative.
You're welcome.
Nice job.
Yes, thank you very much, John. It was very good.
Thank you.